Smoke is rising over Abadan tonight because U.S. strikes just slammed into the oldest oil refinery in the entire Middle East, and Iran's fuel supply is now hanging by a thread. This is not some random industrial site. This is the birthplace of Iran's modern oil industry, a refinery that has been running since 1912, and it just got hit in the middle of one of the most dangerous escalations this region has seen in months. If you thought the strikes on Iran's coastline were bad, wait until you hear what happens when the fuel stops flowing inside the country itself. According to Iranian officials and state media, American strikes hit the city of Abadan directly, along with the nearby port city of Mashhar, as part of a broader wave of attacks that also struck Keshem Island and Kish Island. Abadan sits in the oil-rich Khuzestan province in southwestern Iran, close to the border with Iraq, and it is home to the largest and oldest refinery complex in the entire country. Valiola Hayati, the deputy governor of Khuzestan, confirmed the strikes on the city to Iran's state news agency, marking one of the most significant blows yet to Iran's domestic energy infrastructure since this latest round of fighting reignited. Local reports also indicated that at least one person was wounded in the strike on Abadan, adding a human cost to what is already a massive economic and strategic hit for Tehran. To understand why this particular target matters so much, you need to understand what the Abadan refinery actually represents. It was originally opened back in 1912 by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, built as a pipeline terminus that quickly grew into one of the largest refineries anywhere in the world. For over a century, it has been the beating heart of Iran's fuel production. And today, it still produces around a quarter of the entire country's domestic fuel needs. We're talking about gasoline, kerosene, jet fuel, gas oil, liquefied petroleum gas, bitumen, and a long list of other refined petroleum products that Iranian civilians and Iranian military operations both depend on every single day. Like and subscribe right now if you want to keep following this story, because a hit on a facility this important does not just affect soldiers and generals. It affects everyday people trying to fill up their cars and heat their homes. The refinery has a daily processing capacity of around 430,000 barrels of crude oil, making it not just historically significant, but functionally massive in terms of modern output. Losing even a fraction of that capacity, even temporarily, creates real strain on Iran's ability to keep its own domestic fuel network running smoothly, especially at a moment when the country is already dealing with a renewed American naval blockade, choking off its export routes through the Strait of Hormuz. When you combine reduced export capacity with damage to domestic refining capacity, you start to see why analysts are using words like critical to describe what's happening to Iran's fuel supply right now. This is not actually the first time Abadan has found itself in the crosshairs during this broader period of instability. Back in earlier months of this year, a section of the refinery caught fire, though that earlier incident was contained relatively quickly. Without any reported fatalities or serious injuries, explosions and fires at Iranian industrial and military sites, including pipelines and refineries, have unfortunately not been a rare occurrence over the past several years, though Iranian authorities have often declined to fully explain the causes behind many of these incidents. This latest strike, however, is different because it comes directly amid an active, acknowledged American military campaign, with U.S. Central Command openly confirming ongoing operations against targets across the country, rather than Iran having to guess at the source of an unexplained blast. The timing of the Abadan strike lines up with what has become a rapidly intensifying pattern of American military action against Iran. Just hours before and after the reports out of Abadan emerged, CENTCOM confirmed it had launched a fresh wave of strikes hitting Bushehr and Bandar Abbas, targeting coastal defense systems, missile sites, and drone installations as part of the broader campaign to degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Gulf. Explosions were also reported near the Strait of Hormuz, with Iranian state television describing multiple blasts west of Bandar Abbas on the same night that Abadan and Mashhar came under fire. In other words, this was not an isolated strike on a single refinery. It was one piece of a much larger, coordinated night of American military operations spanning the length of Iran's southern coastline. Iran, predictably, did not sit back and absorb these hits quietly. In the same window of time that Abadan was struck, Iranian forces launched retaliatory attacks against Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, continuing a pattern of regional escalation that has now drawn in nearly every major country along the Persian Gulf. Iran also struck 2 commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz using missiles, killing 1 crew member and injuring several others, according to the United Arab Emirates. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps went even further in their claims, stating that a retaliatory operation against a base in Bahrain had hit fuel depots there and destroyed a Patriot missile defense radar system, along with other American-linked surveillance equipment. Whether every detail of that claim holds up, it's clear both sides are now trading blows across multiple fronts simultaneously, and the intensity is only accelerating. Iran's deputy foreign minister has since accused the United States of effectively destroying the fragile interim peace agreement that had briefly held earlier this summer, declaring that Tehran no longer considers itself bound by any commitments. That kind of statement is significant because it signals that Iran views this latest wave OF strikes, including the hit on Abadan, as crossing a line that erases whatever diplomatic progress had been made in previous months. Analysts covering the region have described the current situation as a low-intensity war that is steadily becoming more persistent, with real concern that continued escalation on both sides could tip things back into the kind of full-scale conflict the region experienced earlier this year. The economic fallout from the Abadan strike, layered on top of everything else happening in the Gulf right now, has been immediate and severe. Brent crude oil prices jumped sharply following the news, climbing above $85 a barrel for the first time since prices eased after an earlier ceasefire agreement, with some reports showing Brent surging past $87 a barrel as the situation continued to develop. West Texas Intermediate, the main U.S. benchmark, also climbed several percentage points in the same window. When a facility as significant as Abadan comes under direct fire, global energy traders do not wait around to assess the details. They react instantly, and that reaction ripples through fuel prices worldwide almost overnight. Iranian officials, for their part, have tried to project confidence that the country's oil sector can absorb these hits without collapsing entirely. Oil Minister Mohsen Panajad said publicly that Iran had managed to export around 80 million barrels of oil over the preceding 26 days, despite the reimposition of American sanctions waivers, insisting that mechanisms built up over recent years have effectively neutralized much of the impact of U.S. economic pressure. That messaging is clearly aimed at reassuring both domestic audiences and international oil markets that Iran's energy sector remains functional, but a direct strike on the country's largest and oldest refinery complicates that narrative considerably, especially when that refinery supplies such a large share of Iran's own domestic fuel consumption rather than just export volume. It's worth remembering that a hit on domestic refining capacity carries different consequences than a hit on export infrastructure. Export disruptions primarily hurt Iran's revenue and its ability to fund its government and military operations from abroad. Domestic refining disruptions hit something much closer to home, quite literally, by threatening the supply of gasoline, kerosene, and heating fuel that ordinary Iranian citizens rely on every single day. If Abadan's output is meaningfully reduced for any extended period, Iran could face fuel shortages, longer lines at gas stations, and rationing measures inside the country itself, the kind of visible, everyday hardship that tends to generate real public frustration, regardless of how a government tries to spin the messaging around it. There's also a symbolic dimension to targeting Abadan that shouldn't be overlooked. This refinery has stood for more than a century as a source of national pride and economic identity for Iran, tracing its roots back to the earliest days of the country's oil industry under British colonial-era operations, before later being nationalized. Striking a facility with that kind of historical weight sends a message that goes beyond simple military calculation, signaling that no piece of Iran's energy infrastructure, no matter how symbolically significant or historically protected it might have seemed, is considered off-limits in this current campaign. That is exactly the kind of message that tends to provoke a fierce response from Iranian leadership, who have consistently framed attacks on their oil infrastructure as attacks on national sovereignty itself. Regional dynamics continue to spiral alongside all of this. Kuwait's military reported actively engaging what it described as hostile drone threats in the days surrounding the Abadan strike, part of an ongoing pattern of what Kuwaiti officials have characterized as continued Iranian aggression across the wider Gulf region. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of U.S. Central Command, issued a statement accusing Iran of intentionally targeting civilians by striking commercial vessels, citing several ships hit and numerous civilian crew members killed, missing, or injured over just the preceding week. That statement framed the American strikes, including the one on Abadan, as a direct response to what Washington characterizes as deliberate Iranian aggression against civilian shipping, rather than purely offensive military action. Shipping companies operating in the region are clearly feeling the strain of this rapidly deteriorating security environment. A Dutch shipping company confirmed one of its vessels was attacked off the coast of Oman in the Arabian Sea during the same period of intensified fighting, even as maritime trade monitoring agencies reported additional missile strikes against tankers transiting both inbound and outbound routes near Omani waters. With commercial shipping increasingly caught in the crossfire, and now a direct strike on Iran's most historic refinery added to the mix, the picture emerging from the Gulf region is one of rapidly compounding risk across nearly every dimension of the energy supply chain, from the wells and refineries themselves all the way through to the tankers trying to move that fuel to market. What happens next depends heavily on how Iran chooses to respond to this specific strike on Abadan, given how symbolically and practically significant the facility is to the country's identity and daily functioning. If Tehran views this as a red line that has now been crossed, we could see an even sharper escalation in retaliatory strikes against American allies and interests across the region in the days ahead. Let's talk a little more about why Khuzestan province, where Abadan sits, matters so much to Iran's entire economy. This is the heartland of Iranian oil production, a region that has quietly powered the country's energy sector for well over a century, long before Iran became the geopolitical flashpoint it is today. Khuzestan is home to some of the largest oil fields in the country, along with major pipeline networks that feed both domestic refineries and export terminals along the coast. When a facility inside this province comes under direct attack, it doesn't just threaten one refinery, it puts a spotlight on the vulnerability of an entire regional energy ecosystem that Iran has spent generations building and protecting. That's part of why this particular strike is generating so much attention compared to some of the more purely military targets hit earlier in this campaign. It also helps to understand how deeply Iranian civilians depend on refineries like Abadan in their daily lives in ways that are easy to overlook from the outside. Gasoline subsidies have long been a politically sensitive issue inside Iran, with past attempts to raise fuel prices triggering serious public unrest and protests in previous years. If Abadan's output takes a meaningful hit, and fuel becomes scarcer or more expensive as a result, the Iranian government could find itself facing pressure not just from foreign adversaries, but from its own population, frustrated by long lines at gas stations and rising costs for basic transportation and heating needs. That domestic political risk is something Iranian leadership has to weigh carefully, on top of everything else happening on the military front right now. There's also a technical angle worth exploring here, because refineries like Abadan are not simple facilities that can just be quickly repaired after taking damage. Modern oil refining involves an incredibly complex chain of processing units, distillation towers, catalytic crackers, and storage infrastructure that all have to work in careful coordination to convert raw crude oil into usable fuel products. Even a strike that damages what looks like a relatively small section of a refinery complex can knock out critical processing capacity for weeks or even months, especially if specialized equipment or safety systems are affected, and international supply chains for replacement parts are disrupted by ongoing sanctions and conflict. Given that Iran has faced years of sanctions limiting its access to certain industrial equipment and technical expertise, any serious damage to Abadan's infrastructure could prove far more difficult and slow to repair than a similar strike might be for a country with fewer restrictions on importing replacement parts. Meanwhile, the broader context of Iran's fuel situation has been under strain for quite some time, even before the specific strike on Abadan took place. Sanctions pressure, reduced access to international financing, and years of underinvestment in aging infrastructure have all combined to leave much of Iran's energy sector operating well below its full potential capacity for years now. Some analysts who track the Iranian energy sector closely have pointed out that facilities like Abadan were already running with outdated equipment in certain sections, making them more vulnerable to serious damage from strikes than a modernized refinery might be. Layer a direct military strike on top of those pre-existing vulnerabilities, and you start to understand why officials and analysts are using words like critical to describe the current state of Iran's fuel supply chain. The regional ripple effects of this strike extend well beyond just Iran's own borders, too. Iraq, which shares a border directly across from Abadan and has significant economic ties to the Khuzestan region, has historically watched developments in this area closely given the potential for spillover effects on its own energy infrastructure and cross-border trade. Any sustained disruption to Iranian refining capacity in this border region could also complicate informal trade routes and fuel smuggling networks that have developed over years of sanctions, networks that both Iranian and neighboring communities have come to rely on in various ways. It's a reminder that infrastructure targets like Abadan sit at the intersection of military strategy, domestic politics, and cross-border economic relationships that don't respect the neat lines drawn on a map. Global oil markets, for their part, continue to watch every single development coming out of the Gulf region with intense scrutiny, and the Abadan strike has only added another layer of uncertainty to an already volatile pricing environment. Energy traders have to weigh not just the immediate loss of refining capacity, but the broader signal this strike sends about how far the United States appears willing to go in targeting Iran's energy infrastructure moving forward. If facilities as historically significant and domestically important as Abadan are now considered fair targets, traders have to start pricing in the possibility that even more critical pieces of Iran's energy backbone, including major export terminals and offshore production platforms, could come under fire in the weeks ahead. That kind of forward-looking risk assessment is part of why oil prices tend to jump so sharply on news like this, even before the full extent of the physical damage is confirmed. There's also been growing discussion among regional security analysts about whether strikes like the one on Abadan are meant to serve a dual purpose. degrading Iran's military-adjacent infrastructure, while simultaneously applying maximum economic pressure to force Tehran back to the negotiating table on more favorable terms for Washington. Refineries, after all, often support military logistics operations alongside civilian fuel needs, providing jet fuel, diesel, and other petroleum products that Iranian military units depend on just as much as ordinary citizens do. By hitting a facility this central to the national fuel supply, American planners may be betting that the combined military and economic pressure will accomplish more than purely military strikes on isolated defense installations ever could on their own. For Gulf allies and neighboring countries watching all of this unfold, the strike on Abadan adds yet another layer of uncertainty to an already tense regional atmosphere. Countries like Iraq, which maintain complex economic and political relationships with both Iran and the United States simultaneously, often find themselves in an especially difficult position when strikes hit facilities this close to their own borders. Any environmental or safety concerns arising from damage to a major refining complex, including the potential for fires, toxic smoke, or contamination affecting nearby waterways, could also become a regional humanitarian and environmental issue extending well beyond the immediate military and economic calculations currently dominating headlines. It's also worth considering how this strike fits into the historical pattern of energy warfare more broadly, because targeting an adversary's refining capacity is a strategy with deep roots in modern military history. Attacking fuel production rather than just battlefield forces has repeatedly proven to be one of the most effective ways to grind down a country's overall warfighting capacity, since modern militaries depend on a constant, reliable supply of refined fuel for everything from fighter jets and naval vessels to ground transport and logistics convoys. By striking Abadan specifically, American military planners appear to be following that same well-established logic, aiming to slowly choke off Iran's ability to sustain prolonged military operations by targeting the fuel production system that underpins nearly every branch of its armed forces. Not just the coastal defense systems and missile sites that have dominated earlier nights of this campaign. That strategic shift from purely coastal and defensive targets toward core domestic energy infrastructure may represent an important turning point in how this conflict is being fought. Earlier strikes focused heavily on systems designed to protect Iran's shoreline and threaten shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. But the move to hit Abadan signals a willingness to go after the deeper economic and logistical foundations that keep the country running day to day. If this pattern continues in the coming nights, we could see additional strikes on other refining and energy production facilities across Iran, each one adding further strain to an already stretched domestic fuel supply and pushing Tehran closer to a genuine crisis point in terms of its ability to keep both its military and civilian population running smoothly. If, on the other hand, this becomes another entry in an already long list of coastal and infrastructure targets hit over recent nights, it may simply reinforce the broader pattern we've already seen play out repeatedly this year, with both sides trading blows while insisting they remain open to some kind of eventual negotiated resolution. Either way, with Iran's fuel supply now facing real and measurable strain following this strike, and with global oil markets bracing for whatever comes next in this rapidly shifting conflict, the pressure on Tehran to make a decisive move, diplomatic or military, is higher than it has been in weeks. Make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next major development, because with a target this significant now in the mix, this conflict just entered a new and far more critical phase.